You've seen them, maybe on a subway platform, maybe outside a stadium, maybe on a street corner with a folding table and a megaphone. Men in robes, sometimes turbans, sometimes tassels at the waist, shouting verses at strangers walking past. Some are calm, handing out pamphlets, and others are screaming that you're cursed, that you're lost, that you don't know who you are. And one phrase keeps surfacing. They are the real Jews, not the people in Israel, not the people you went to school with. Them. That moment confuses almost everyone who experiences it, because it's a weird situation. It's not quite a church, not quite a protest, not quite Judaism, even though it's using the Torah. So you go home and type 3 words into a search bar. Black Hebrew Israelite. What comes back is a mess. One link says a new religious movement. Another says hate groups. A third says actually, some of them might be onto something. This video exists to sort through that mess properly, the same way we did with the Moors and with Black Indians, by separating the claim from the evidence and the evidence from the politics. No side gets the benefit of the doubt here. Not the preachers, not their critics, just what's actually documented. Here's the first thing almost nobody explains correctly. Black Hebrew Israelite isn't one belief system, one church, or one leader. It's closer to a family tree with a lot of estranged relatives, all tracing back to the same root idea, who now barely agree with each other and sometimes actively despise each other. There are at least 3 very different groups hiding under one label, and confusing them is exactly why this conversation gets so complicated. At the root sits a single claim. The ancient Israelites of the Bible were Black, and African Americans today are their direct biological descendants, separated from that identity by the transatlantic slave trade. That's the claim. Everything else, the rituals, the politics, the posture toward Jewish people and white people, grows out of how each branch chooses to interpret that one claim. 3 branches grew from it, and they look nothing alike. The first branch is the most traditional. Groups like the Church of God and Saints of Christ, founded in Kansas in 1896, kept close to actual Jewish practice. Hebrew calendar, Saturday Sabbath, circumcision, Passover, yarmulkes, layered with Christian elements like baptism. The posture here was reverent toward Jewish tradition, not hostile to it. These are the Black Hebrews in the strictest sense, and historically, this branch did not define itself by hating anyone. The second branch is more nationalist, and it's probably where most people's mental image actually comes from without realizing it. These groups, often calling themselves Black Israelites rather than Black Hebrews, drifted further from anything resembling normative Judaism and closer to a movement built around Black political consciousness, especially from the 1960s onward. They built a tighter, more exclusive sense of who counted as a real Israelite without yet building it around hatred of outsiders. The third branch is where the street corner preachers live, and where this gets genuinely dangerous. These groups, often grouped under what researchers call the One West movement, trace back to a man named Abba Bivens, teaching out of a Harlem storefront on a street called One West in the 1960s. Out of that one school came the camps you've actually seen shouting in public: Israel United in Christ, the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ. These 3 branches are not the same movement wearing different hats. The Kansas Church from 1896 would not recognize the Harlem street preacher as a fellow traveler, and the street preacher has no interest in being mistaken for a quiet, devotional congregation. Hold this taxonomy as we go, because later in this video, when we get to the anti-Semitism and the actual violence, it belongs almost entirely to one of these three branches. Not all of them, one. So here's the actual question hiding underneath all of this, the one nobody quite states out loud. Before you can ask whether African Americans are descended from the ancient Israelites, you have to ask a much stranger and more basic question first. Who exactly counts as a Jew? Who decides that, and has that answer ever actually been settled? Because once you look closely, you'll find the gatekeeping argument didn't start with this movement. It's much older than that. Most people assume this question has a clean, ancient answer. It doesn't. And that single fact does more work in this video than almost anything else we'll cover. The modern standard most people know, that Jewish identity passes through the mother, isn't actually the original biblical rule. The Bible itself traces lineage through the father. Matrilineal descent was a later development, formalized in the Mishnah around the 2nd century, centuries after Abraham, Moses, or David. That change wasn't universally adopted either. Reform and Reconstructionist Judaism today accept patrilineal descent as long as the child is raised Jewish. Karaite Judaism, a smaller, older tradition, still uses patrilineal descent exclusively. So before any Black Hebrew Israelite claim enters the conversation, mainstream, uncontested Judaism already contains multiple, disagreeing answers to who counts. The rule changed once already, and different communities never fully agreed on the change. Then there's the second pathway, and this one matters even more. Anyone of any ancestry can become fully Jewish through religious conversion. Once the process is complete, that person holds the exact same status as someone born into it. This isn't a modern workaround. It's modeled directly on the book of Ruth, a Moabite woman who becomes the great-grandmother of King David. Becoming Jewish by religion has never required a drop of provable ancestry, which raises an obvious question, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a dodge. If sincere conversion has always been enough, on what basis does anyone get to tell another sincere group they aren't real Jews? The answer is uncomfortable. Religious authorities make exactly that call constantly, and they don't agree with each other when they make it. Real Jew already depends on whose court you happen to be standing in, long before this movement existed. This isn't theoretical. It has already happened more than once to communities nobody seriously accuses of inventing their identity. In 1962, an Indian Jewish community called the Bnei Israel ran straight into it. When a Bnei Israel man wanted to marry outside his community, Israel's chief rabbi instructed registering rabbis to investigate Bnei Israel lineage for possible non-Jewish descent before approving the marriage. Indian newspapers called it what it looked like: racism. It took 2 more years and a direct intervention from Israel's secular government under Prime Minister Levi Eshkol to override the religious ruling and declare the Bnei Israel Jews without exception, equal in every respect. Read that sequence again. A devout, centuries-old Jewish community needed the government to overrule its own religious court before its members could simply marry inside the wider Jewish world without suspicion attached to their blood. Beta Israel, the Jewish community of Ethiopia, tells a harder version of the same story. Isolated from rabbinic Judaism for at least 2,000 years, they kept their own Sabbath, their own dietary law, their own priesthood, with zero contact with the rest of world Jewry. Israeli religious authorities spent years arguing over whether they were really Jewish before recognizing them. 2 dramatic airlifts. Operation Moses in 1984. Operation Solomon in 1991. Finally brought tens of thousands home. Recognition didn't end it. Ethiopian Israelis today report median incomes roughly 40% below the general Jewish population, ongoing housing segregation, and ongoing distrust from parts of the religious establishment. In 2015, footage surfaced of an Ethiopian Israeli soldier in uniform being beaten by police on a Tel Aviv street, which triggered nationwide protests. Being devout, ancestrally confirmed, and formally recognized did not buy this community equal standing. It bought them entry into a hierarchy. So here's the pattern worth sitting with before we ever get to the Black Hebrew Israelite claim itself. There already exists a real, documented history of lighter-skinned, more institutionally powerful Jewish populations deciding who counts and how they get treated once they're in, even against communities whose devotion was never seriously in question. That's not a Black Hebrew Israelite talking point. That's the Israeli press, Israeli courts, and Israeli government records describing Israeli Jews. Israel's actual citizenship law, the law of return, complicates the picture further rather than simplifying it. Passed in 1950, it grants automatic citizenship to anyone with a Jewish mother, but also to anyone with just one Jewish grandparent, a far broader ancestry net than Orthodox religious law uses. It's a secular test, deliberately wider than the religious one, but it cuts the other way too, on belief rather than blood. And that detail will matter later in this video. A person born Jewish who later converts to another faith, including some Messianic Jewish congregations, loses automatic return rights, even though some religious authorities would still consider them ethnically Jewish. So Israel's own law disagrees with Israel's own religious courts about who qualifies in both directions at once. Broader on ancestry, narrower on current belief. Keep that contradiction in your pocket. We'll need it later, when this movement's own migrants ran straight into it. One more comparison, because it's a fair one and people raise it constantly. Isn't this just like Christian denominations all claiming to be the real Christianity? Structurally, yes. Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants have made exactly this argument about each other for centuries, and no outsider gets to settle it by decree. The difference is consequence. Christian denominational disputes don't usually carry citizenship, land, or legal recognition. Jewish identity, in Israel specifically, carries all three. So, when a group says, "We are the real Jews," it isn't only a theological claim the way "we are the real Christians" would be. It's a claim that, if accepted, would carry actual legal weight in a specific country. That's a real part of why this particular identity argument draws so much more institutional resistance and scrutiny than an equivalent argument inside Christianity ever does. The stakes aren't just spiritual, they're bureaucratic. Now that we know what Jewish means and how contested that meaning actually is, we can trace what Jewish ancestry actually looks like across history. Because the Black Hebrew Israelite claim plugs into a specific point in that history. To evaluate the plug, you need to know the line it's connecting to. So, let's run it from the beginning as quickly and truthful as the material allows. The story starts with Abraham, a figure from the ancient Near East who, according to tradition, entered into a covenant with God and became the patriarch of the people who would become Israel. Abraham is the theological starting point of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam simultaneously. That alone should tell you something about how much work this single ancestral claim is quietly doing across human history. Historically, his existence isn't independently verified. He's the traditional origin, not the documented one. From Abraham comes the patriarchal lineage. Isaac, Jacob, whose name gets changed to Israel, and then Jacob's 12 sons, who become the 12 tribes. This is the framework the Black Hebrew Israelite movement will later map African American identity onto, tribe by tribe, which is why the family structure matters. These 12 tribes form the Kingdom of Israel, which eventually splits into two kingdoms, the Northern Kingdom of Israel covering 10 tribes, and the Southern Kingdom of Judah covering 2. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire conquers the north. The 10 northern tribes are deported, scattered, absorbed. They disappear from the historical record as a coherent group. This is the actual origin of the phrase, lost tribes of Israel. And it's worth noting clearly, this loss happened in 722 BCE, more than 2,000 years before the transatlantic slave trade. Every lost tribe claim, including the Black Hebrew Israelite version, is filling in a gap created at that specific moment in ancient history. The Southern Kingdom survives longer, but not indefinitely. Babylon conquers Judah in 586 BCE, destroys the first temple, and deports the Judahite elite to Babylon. A generation later, the Persian king Cyrus allows them to return. They rebuild the temple, reorganize their religious practice, and this post-exile period is actually where a lot of what we recognize as Judaism today gets codified. The Torah formally compiled, the synagogue system developed, the rabbinical tradition taking shape. Then Rome. The Roman Empire eventually absorbs the Jewish homeland, and two catastrophic revolts follow. In 70 CE, the Romans destroy the Second Temple, the one Babylon had allowed to be rebuilt. A second revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, is crushed in 135 CE. Hundreds of thousands are killed. Survivors are enslaved and dispersed across the Roman world. A specific verse in Deuteronomy, chapter 28, warns Israel that disobedience will result in being shipped back to Egypt in slave ships, and the people will find no buyers. We'll come back to exactly what that verse was actually describing. How you read it is the hinge of the entire Black Hebrew Israelite textual argument. After 135 CE, what you have is a people scattered without a homeland, preserving identity through religious practice rather than territorial continuity. Different communities land in different places and slowly develop different characteristics over centuries. The Ashkenazi Jews settle across Central and Eastern Europe. The Sephardi Jews settle in Iberia, North Africa, and the Ottoman Empire until the Spanish Inquisition's expulsion of 1492 drives a second dispersal. The Mizrahi Jews remain across the Middle East and North Africa. The Yemenite Jews develop their own distinct tradition in the Arabian Peninsula. Then there are the communities that get overlooked almost entirely in Western discussions. Ben Israel in India, present in the Konkan coast for at least 1,000 years, some scholars argue 2,000. The Cochin Jews, also in India with different earlier roots. The Beta Israel in Ethiopia, already practicing a distinct form of Judaism, so isolated that they developed independently of the Inki rabbinic tradition that shapes nearly everything else called Judaism today. Real communities, real continuity, radically different from the European Jewish image most people carry. Modern Israel is the product of all these streams converging in one place within living memory. And here's where the "how Jewish is Israel really?" question gets an actual data answer. A 2019 representative survey corroborated across multiple academic and demographic outlets found Israeli Jews break down roughly as follows: about 44.9% Mizrahi and Sephardi, about 44.2% Ashkenazi, around 3% Beta Israel, and about 8% mixed or other. No official government census category tracks this. These are survey estimates, and Israeli authorities have never formally categorized their population this way. By 135 CE, the Jewish homeland no longer exists as a political reality. What follows for the next 17 centuries is a people maintaining identity without territory through religious practice, communal law, and shared memory rather than shared geography. Different communities landed in different places and developed differently over those centuries. Understanding who those communities were and which one organized the return matters enormously for every other argument this video makes. The organized push to reestablish a Jewish homeland is called Zionism, and it emerged in the late 19th century out of a specific geographic and cultural context. Its founding theorist was Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist, writing in Vienna in 1896, the same year William Saunders Crowdy was founding his Hebrew Israelite Church in Kansas. Herzl's 1896 pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, was written in German, addressed to European Jewish communities, and emerged directly from European anti-Semitism. Zionism wasn't a global Jewish movement at first. It was an European Jewish response to "O European Jewish problem." The founders, funders, and early political architects of what became the State of Israel were overwhelmingly Ashkenazi. The figures who built the Zionist political apparatus, negotiated the Balfour Declaration in 1917, organized the early waves of immigration into Palestine under the Ottoman and then British mandate, and ultimately proclaimed the state in May 1948 came almost entirely from that population. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, was born in what is now Poland. Golda Meir, who would later become prime minister, was born in Ukraine. Chaim Weizmann, who became Israel's first president, was born in what is now Belarus. The founding generation of the Israeli state was Eastern European. This matters because Ashkenazi doesn't mean from the tribe of Benjamin or descended from the northern kingdom. It describes a cultural and geographic branch of the Jewish diaspora that spent centuries in Central and Eastern Europe, developed the Yiddish language, built distinct liturgical traditions, and faced distinct forms of persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardi, Yemenite, these are not tribe names. They're diaspora addresses. They describe where Jewish communities lived after the dispersions, not which of Jacob's 12 sons anyone descends from. The 12-tribe structure of the ancient Israelites did not survive the dispersions intact as a set of maintained genealogical records. It survived as a religious text. The law of return, passed by Israel's new government in 1950, was designed to bring Jewish communities home. But home, in practice, meant home to a state built by and structured around Ashkenazi institutional culture. When large Mizrahi and Sephardi populations arrived, mostly from Middle Eastern and North African countries after 1948, they were Jewish in every religious and ancestral sense. But they arrived into a hierarchy that didn't consider them equals. The term Second Israel circulated for decades to describe their experience. Lower wages, peripheral housing, cultural dismissal. Fully Jewish, not fully welcome. So, the practical answer to who could return under the law of return is this. Anyone with a Jewish mother or one Jewish grandparent could claim automatic citizenship. But automatic citizenship and actual equality in the new state were not the same thing. Which community controlled the institutions, set the religious court standards, and defined what counted as appropriately Jewish in practice was the Ashkenazi establishment. And it made those determinations with authority over everyone else who arrived, regardless of how ancient their own tradition was. Now, for the Ethiopian and Indian question specifically, the Ben Israel of India's Konkan coast have been there for at least 1,000 years. Some scholars argue too. Their own tradition says their ancestors arrived after a shipwreck on the coast, fleeing persecution in Israel somewhere between 175 BCE and the early Common Era. They maintained Jewish practices, the Sabbath, dietary laws, circumcision, in near total isolation from the wider Jewish world for centuries, without Talmud, without rabbinical contact, in a form the rabbinic tradition would barely recognize on first encounter. There's no scholarly consensus on a precise origin date, but the genetic and historical evidence is consistent with a Levantine origin for a founding male ancestor group, similar structurally to what the Limba case showed in southern Africa, a real ancestral signal from a real migration, preserved over many generations. The Cochin Jews, also in India, are a smaller, distinct community on Kerala's coast with a different and earlier origin story. Their tradition traces settlement to the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, an earlier dispersal than the Roman period, which would make them among the oldest diaspora communities on Earth. Documentary evidence places them definitively in Kerala by the 11th century at latest, with a copper plate land grant from a local king that still exists. Different from Bene Israel, different settlement story, same Indian subcontinent. Beta Israel, the Jewish community of Ethiopia, represents a third African origin scenario that has to be separated clearly from the other two. They did not claim to arrive from a specific Levantine migration of the lost tribes, at least not in the form scholars have been able to verify. What they preserved was a form of Judaism so isolated it had no contact with rabbinic development at all. No Talmud, no Hanukkah, a priestly system called Kohanim rather than rabbis. The two main origin theories among scholars are a migration through Yemen of some Israelite or early Jewish community in the first few centuries of the Common Era, and an indigenous Ethiopian conversion to an early form of Israelite practice through contact with Yemenite Jewish traders, followed by complete isolation. The scholarly debate hasn't closed. What is clear is that these weren't people who decided last century they were Israelites. The practice runs at minimum 1,500 years in documented form. What all of this means for the law of return's practical operation is more precise than the law itself suggests. Ethiopian Jews needed Israeli state airlifts, with decades of religious controversy preceding them, not because they weren't Jewish, but because the people operating the institutional machinery of the Israeli state had to be persuaded that these Black African practitioners of a pre-rabbinic Jewish tradition fit inside a framework designed by European Jews for European Jews. Indian Jewish communities needed the secular government to override religious court rulings before their marriages would be treated equally. The gate opened for all of them eventually, but it opened on terms set by the founders, and the founders were Ashkenazi, and the Ashkenazi founders did not design the gate with these communities primarily in mind. This also explains a pattern the Black Hebrew Israelite movement uses as evidence of bad faith, but which has a more bureaucratic explanation. African and peripheral Jewish communities have sometimes found Israel supportive of their practice at a distance, willing to send Torah scrolls, teachers, recognition without that support translating into automatic law of return citizenship. That's not necessarily hypocrisy. It reflects the real distinction the law was designed to draw between Jewish communities globally, which Israel supports as a matter of cultural and religious solidarity, and legal citizens of the Israeli state, which is a different and more specific status with security, housing, and resource implications. A government can care about a community without opening its citizenship process to every member of that community on any timeline they choose. That the line exists is an evidence of bad faith. Where the line gets drawn, and by whom, is where the real argument lives. That last detail is itself telling. A state built explicitly on Jewish identity doesn't officially categorize its Jewish citizens by ethnic origin. Yet, the ethnic divisions are real enough that there's a recognized term, Second Israel, used to describe the historical experience of Mizrahi and Sephardi citizens who arrived largely from Middle Eastern and North African countries after 1948 and found themselves treated as socially inferior by the Ashkenazi establishment that controlled the early institutions of the state. Development towns in the periphery, lower wage work, cultural dismissal. This wasn't ancient history. Mizrahi Jews in Israel have described living for decades as second-class citizens within a Jewish state built partly on the rhetoric of Jewish equality. The political consequences still shape Israeli elections today. So when the Black Hebrew Israelite movement talks about Jewish institutional power as a monolith, the reality is more fractured than that. The people holding most of that institutional power have always been a specific subset of world Jewry, and other Jewish populations have had their own grievances with exactly that subset for decades. None of this settles the Black Hebrew Israelite claim, but it does mean the claim lands in a more complicated landscape than either side usually admits. The Jewish world it's reacting to is not a unified block with a single shared definition of itself. It's a set of historically distinct populations, joined by religion and in some cases, ancestry, with their own live internal arguments about hierarchy, belonging, and who counts. Before we get to African Americans specifically, we need to ask a prior question. Did any African population have a real, documentable connection to Jewish ancestry or Jewish practice before the transatlantic slave trade ever happened? Because if the answer is yes, anywhere on the continent, it tells us the tools exist to find it. And if the answer is no in the specific regions that matter, that tells us something equally important. Let's start with the one case where the answer is an unambiguous yes, and it's a remarkable case. The Limba are a Bantu-speaking people of roughly 70,000, living across South Africa and Zimbabwe. Their oral tradition claims descent from a male ancestor group called the Buba clan, who migrated south from a place called Sena, somewhere to the north. They've kept certain practices across generations: a prohibition on pork, ritual slaughter of animals, a sacred object called the Ngoma Longundu that functions somewhat like a holy ark. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, geneticists tested this. They looked at the Cohen modal haplotype, a specific Y chromosome signature found at elevated frequency among Jewish priests. The Kohanim, considered a potential genetic marker of ancient Hebraic paternal lineage. What they found in Buba clan men stopped the researchers. 52% carried this haplotype, a frequency higher than in some actual Kohanim populations tested. The genetic signature pointed to Yemen, not Africa, not Europe, Yemen. That result matters on multiple levels. A 70-generation oral tradition passed in a language with no writing system through the upheaval of Bantu migrations and South African colonial history turned out to be substantially correct. These men's Y chromosomes confirm their grandfathers' stories. For anyone tempted to dismiss African oral tradition about origins as automatically unreliable, the Limba case is the necessary first thing to know. The tools exist. The methodology works. When there's a real signal, it gets found. Now, here's where the honest analytical work starts. Because the Limba result gets used by analogy in some Black Hebrew Israelite arguments. The logic is, if it happened for the Limba, why not for us? But the Limba case is narrow, specific, and traceable in ways the BII claim about African Americans is not. The Limba made a claim about a specific clan in a specific place, descending from a specific migration. That's exactly the kind of precise, falsifiable claim that can be tested. The BHI claim about African Americans is broader by several orders of magnitude. Beta Israel tells a different kind of African Jewish story. An isolated community in the Ethiopian highlands, practicing a form of Judaism with no rabbinic influence whatsoever, no Talmud, no Hanukkah, keeping a Sabbath, observing dietary laws, maintaining a priestly caste for somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years, with no meaningful contact with the wider Jewish world. When modern Jewish scholars finally made sustained contact with them in the 19th century, the finding was not that someone had taught them to pretend. The finding was that they'd been doing this on their own. Israel spent years internally debating their recognition before a 1975 ruling by Chief Rabbi Ovadia Yosef acknowledged them as Jews. Operations Moses in 1984 and Solomon in 1991 airlifted more than 20,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel under extraordinary conditions. Moses was secret, halted when it became public. Solomon ran for 36 hours straight, 70 people per plane, to complete before diplomatic pressure stopped it. These were not symbolic gestures. They were logistical commitments backed by state resources. And then, recognition ran into its limits. Ethiopian Israelis today report a median income roughly 40% below the general Jewish population. Housing discrimination is documented. Religious authorities in some cases required Ethiopian Jews to undergo symbolic reconversion before certain ceremonies, despite their formal state recognition. A requirement applied to no other Jewish immigrant group. In 2015, an Ethiopian Israeli soldier in uniform was filmed being beaten by police on a Tel Aviv street. The protests that followed drew tens of thousands. Formal recognition, real Jewish ancestry, real devotion, and still second class. Now to West Africa, specifically the Igbo of Nigeria, because this is where the ancestry question makes direct contact with the populations the transatlantic slave trade actually drew from. Igbo territory supplied a significant portion of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas. There's a long-standing set of claims that the Igbo have ancient Jewish ancestry based on cultural parallels. Circumcision at 8 days, Sabbath-like rest days, harvest festivals, certain naming patterns. These claims were directly tested. Jewish Voice Ministries International, an organization with every organizational incentive to find a positive result, conducted DNA testing in 2017 on 124 Igbo men, specifically to check for Jewish ancestral lineage. The result: Igbo Y chromosomes belong predominantly to haplogroup E1A, a sub-Saharan African lineage. Not the E1B, J1, or J2 haplogroups associated with Semitic and Jewish populations. The signal was not ambiguous. There was no buried Levantine ancestry waiting to be found. It's worth saying plainly. The same religious authorities who treated the Bene Israel case as settled once Israel's government intervened, and who took years to recognize Beta Israel, also do not recognize Igbo Jewish claims for marriage or aliyah purposes, absent individual matrilineal proof from a recognized Jewish community. The Igbo DNA result wasn't the reason for that. The non-recognition came first. But the DNA result is why we can now say, with the same confidence the Limba case earned on the other side, that the absence of ancestral signal here isn't a gap in the testing. The testing worked. The signal isn't there. Now, for two communities that chose not to claim ancestry at all and instead walked through the conversion door, they wanted to become Jews, not by ancestry, but rather through religious conversion. The Abayudaya of Uganda are a community of roughly 2,000 people whose story starts in 1919 with a Ugandan military leader named Seme Kakungulu. After falling out with British colonial authorities, Kakungulu turned to intensive study of the Old Testament, declared his community Jewish. No external rabbi, no formal institution. He read the text and followed it. They survived things that would have ended most communities. When Idi Amin came to power in 1971, he outlawed the practice of Judaism outright. The Abayudaya renamed their community She'eret Yisrael, the remnant of Israel, and worshipped in private, in secret, for years. When Amin fell, they came back out. From 2002 onward, most of the community undertook formal, recognized conservative conversion. Roughly 1,600 people went through the process. About 400 more completed Orthodox conversion under Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. In 2008, their leader, Gershom Sizomu, was ordained by the conservative movement's rabbinical seminary in Los Angeles, the first native-born black rabbi in sub-Saharan Africa. The Jewish Agency formally recognized the Abayudaya community in 2016. That should have been the end of a long road. It wasn't. Israel's Interior Ministry refused to honor the recognition for law of return purposes. Individuals who had completed full halakhic conversion and led congregations for years were turned away at the citizenship gate. In December 2021, under interior ministry pressure, the Jewish Agency effectively reversed its own 2016 decision. The conservative movement's leadership called it a profound insult. There is no cleaner real-world illustration of what Section 3 described. If you are Black, African, and Jewish in every way the religion actually asks of you, state machinery can still move the line. The House of Israel in Ghana offers a useful contrast and an uncomfortable one. Founded in the 1970s, after a vision experienced by a Sefwi community leader named Aaron Ahotre Towakirafa, who concluded his ancestors had once practiced authentic Judaism before missionaries arrived, the community points to existing Sefwi customs as evidence: Saturday rest, circumcision at 8 days, pork avoidance, menstrual purity practices. No formal conversion completed by the community as a whole. No DNA testing conducted. Yet, international Jewish organizations, including Kulanu and Beichol Lashon, have embraced and materially supported this community for decades. They've sent Torah scrolls, prayer books, funding, visiting teachers, with none of the suspicion or hostility that meets comparable claims in the American context. The structural shape of the claim is almost identical to certain Black Hebrew Israelite founding stories. A single leader's vision in living memory, claimed lost tribe descent, cultural parallels as evidence, no documentary record from the intervening centuries, but the reception is completely different. The true reason isn't evidentiary rigor, because neither community has any. The difference is theological direction. The House of Israel in Ghana makes no claim that existing Jews are frauds or imposters. They are not building an identity that requires someone else's identity to be a lie. That single distinction, not ancestry, not documentation, not DNA, is what separates which claims get welcomed into the Jewish world and which ones trigger institutional resistance. We'll return to that distinction when we examine what the radical wing of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement actually teaches, because the contrast will be sharp. The Black Hebrew Israelite movement didn't start on social media, and it didn't start in the 1960s. It started in the ashes of Reconstruction, in the years after the promises of Black freedom were being systematically dismantled across the American South, law by law, town by town, body by body. Understanding that context doesn't validate the claim, but it does explain why two men in two different states in roughly the same decade both said God came to them with the same core message. The first was William Saunders Crowdy, a former slave and railroad cook from Kansas. In 1896, Crowdy said God appeared to him directly and revealed that African Americans were the true descendants of the ancient Israelites, their identity as a chosen people stripped from them by slavery. He founded the Church of God and Saints of Christ, built around Saturday Sabbath, the Hebrew calendar, and a belief in Jesus as prophet rather than God. That church still exists today. It still holds services. The second was Frank Cherry, a laborer from Tennessee, working around the same time. Cherry's version of the vision produced something stranger and harder. He taught that the earth was physically square, surrounded by 3 layers of heaven, and that white people descended from a biblical figure named Gehazi, a servant cursed with leprosy. He used the Talmud as an authority while simultaneously blaming Jewish people for distorting Israelite history. Cherry built something that Crowdy hadn't quite reached: a theology of grievance alongside the theology of identity. Here's a detail that gets overlooked in almost every mainstream account of this movement, and it matters for understanding how the early structure was built. Many of the earliest Black Hebrew Israelite leaders, including figures in Crowdy's circle, were practicing Freemasons. The movement's earliest rituals borrowed from Masonic structure, hierarchical ranks of knowledge, symbolic initiation, internal teachings revealed in stages. This wasn't assembled purely from careful Bible study in a library. It was built from the spiritual tools Black communities in the late 19th century actually had access to. The movement then shifted north with a Caribbean immigrant named Wentworth Arthur Matthew. Matthew arrived in Harlem and in 1919 founded the Commandment Keepers of the Living God. By 1930, he went further, establishing the Ethiopian Hebrew Rabbinical College, later renamed the Israelite Rabbinical Academy. Matthew ordained more than 20 rabbis who spread out and planted congregations across the country and into the Caribbean. For the first time, this wasn't one charismatic preacher's personal congregation. It had a clergy pipeline. Then came Ben Ami. In 1966, a Chicago steelworker named Ben Carter said he received a vision instructing him to do something none of his predecessors had literally attempted. He didn't just say Black Americans were Israelites. He said they should go home. He renamed himself Ben Ami Ben Israel and began organizing. He led a group of followers through Liberia as a transitional stop, then arrived in Israel in 1969 with several hundred people settling in the Negev desert city of Dimona. Whatever else happened next, this was the first time this theological claim produced a geopolitical act with a real address. Before we go further, one distinction needs to be made clearly, because it's central to how this movement actually understands itself. Most Black Hebrew Israelite branches do not call themselves Jewish. They call themselves Hebrew Israelites. That is a deliberate separation, not an oversight. The claim isn't, we are Jewish. The claim is, we are the original Israelites, and the people currently calling themselves Jewish are not. The radical branches will go further and say, current Jews are frauds or imposters. But even the moderate branches are making a claim of prior, superior legitimacy, not a request for inclusion. That distinction matters practically and historically. A Hebrew Israelite claim is a claim of ancestral monopoly on a specific biblical identity, while Jewish identity, as we covered in Section 3, has always included a real conversion pathway that makes room for anyone. These are not parallel claims occupying the same space. One says, we are the original. Everyone else is secondary or false. The other says, anyone can convert and become a Jew. Understanding that the movement isn't asking to join Judaism, but rather to supersede it, is the only way the later extremism makes theological sense, rather than looking like an arbitrary afterthought. The Black Hebrew Israelite claim isn't built on DNA, at least not originally. It's built on a specific reading of specific passages, and if you don't understand that reading, you'll underestimate how internally coherent this belief feels to people inside it. So, let's walk through the actual textual argument before we dismantle any of it. Because you can't fairly evaluate a case you haven't properly heard. The argument usually starts with Jacob and Esau, twin sons of Isaac in Genesis. Esau is described as red and hairy at birth, and some preachers read red as referring to skin tone. Arguing this marks Esau as the ancestor of red-complexioned European peoples. Jacob, by contrast, is smooth, which gets read as dark-skinned. Jacob is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. If Jacob was black, then The Israelites were black. That's the foundational move, and it happens in Genesis before any other text gets involved. From Genesis, it moves to Daniel. Daniel's vision of God describes hair like the wool of lambs, which gets read literally as tightly coiled black hair. Then to the story of Joseph in Egypt. Joseph is sold into slavery, rises to power in Pharaoh's court, and when his brothers come to Egypt during a famine, they don't recognize him. Preachers ask why. If Joseph were light-skinned in a dark-skinned Egypt, he'd have stood out. The brothers' failure to recognize him is taken as evidence that Joseph, and by extension, all Hebrews, blended into the Egyptian population because they shared the same complexion. Then there's Deuteronomy 28:68, the verse that does the most direct work in connecting the biblical narrative to African American history. It reads as a warning, Israel will be brought back to Egypt in ships, and there they will be sold as slaves to their enemies. Preachers teach this not as a warning about ancient events, but as a prophecy that was fulfilled specifically by the transatlantic slave trade. The ships, the bondage, the loss of identity. If you're reading this verse in 1896 as a formerly enslaved American, that resonance is not nothing. Now let's look at what scholars who've studied these texts carefully say about this reading. The distinction they draw is between exegesis, pulling meaning out of a text based on its actual context, and eisegesis, reading a predetermined conclusion back into a text that was never about that conclusion. Take Deuteronomy 28:68. It is describing events with a real historical referent. Israelites sold into slavery and shipped to Egypt after the Romans crushed the Jewish revolts of 70 and 135 CE. That's a documented historical event. The slave ships in that verse are Mediterranean vessels going to Egypt, not Atlantic vessels going to Virginia. The Daniel passage is also textually narrower than it appears in the argument. Hair like wool appears in a dream vision, describing divine appearance in apocalyptic language. The same passage describes wheels of fire and a figure with clothing white as snow. Reading wool as a specific racial descriptor while reading the surrounding imagery as symbolic requires a selective application of literalism that the text itself doesn't invite. Apply the same rule consistently, and God in Daniel's vision also has flaming wheels, which most traditions treat as poetic, not literal. The Joseph argument is worth engaging seriously because it sounds more plausible than the others. But ancient Egypt was not a racially homogeneous society, and Egyptian art itself proves this. Egyptian painters used a deliberate color palette to distinguish their own population from Nubians to the south and Levantine Semitic peoples to the northeast. Canaanite traders in a tomb painting at Beni Hassan, dating to around 1900 BCE, are depicted with a clearly different skin tone from Nubians in the same tradition. The failure to recognize story about Joseph doesn't require identical skin color anyway. It requires years of absence, changed dress, a throne, an interpreter, and a power dynamic that made recognition psychologically implausible regardless of complexion. Physical evidence for what ancient Israelites actually looked like is limited but not absent. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib's armies conquered the Judean city of Lachish and his palace. Artists carved detailed stone reliefs of the captured Judahites being marched away. An enemy's own depiction of the people they just defeated. Those carvings show short curly hair and curly beards, rendered with the same artistic conventions Assyrian artists used consistently for other Levantine Semitic populations. They're not using the visual vocabulary reserved for sub-Saharan African peoples, whom Assyrian and Egyptian artists absolutely knew how to depict and did depict separately and distinctly in the same artistic tradition. What the physical evidence actually supports is a Near Eastern and Mediterranean appearance, and not the blue-eyed, light-haired version most Western religious art invented centuries later, but also not the West African or Sub-Saharan appearance the Black Hebrew Israelite movement assigns. The ancient Israelites looked like what they were, a Levantine Semitic people from the Eastern Mediterranean, related in appearance to Canaanites, Phoenicians, Arameans, and other populations of the ancient Near East. And that's a genuinely different conclusion from both popular myths, and it satisfies neither side. Before the DNA verdict and before the violence, there's a question worth answering. Of everything Black Americans could have chosen to organize an identity around after slavery, why specifically this? Why ancient Israel? Why Hebrew Israelite claim? It's not an obvious move, and dismissing it as delusion or manipulation doesn't explain why it found and held an audience for over 100 years. Start with what slavery actually took. Not just freedom and labor, though those. It took names, replaced with the names of slave masters. It took languages, replaced with English on the enslavers' terms. It took genealogies. The overwhelming majority of enslaved Africans brought to America have no traceable record of which specific ethnic group, village, or family they came from. The slave trade's documentation system was built around cargo, not people. What came through the ports of Charleston and New Orleans was deliberately stripped of the specificity that makes industry legible. Into that specific void, the Bible was not neutral. It was the dominant text of the enslaving culture, used actively to justify the institution. The curse of Ham, a creative misreading of Genesis 9, was preached from pulpits across the American South as theological authorization for Black enslavement. The same book that told enslaved people to obey their masters was the only book many of them were permitted to learn to read. If you're going to fight a war fought with Scripture, you need Scripture. What the Black Hebrew Israelite founders found was a way to use the same text as a counterweapon. The Exodus story was already doing this work before Crowdy or Cherry appeared. Enslaved Africans had been singing about Moses and Pharaoh for generations. Go Down, Moses isn't a post-slavery composition. It was coded resistance language during slavery. The identification of enslaved Black Americans with the enslaved Israelites in Egypt was built into the spiritual tradition long before anyone formalized it into a theological claim about literal descent. What the Black Hebrew Israelite movement did in 1896 was literalize a metaphor that had already been emotionally true for decades. The menu of identity reconstruction options available to Black Americans in the late 19th and early 20th century is worth naming, because Hebrew Israelite is one choice among several, not the only available move. Garveyism, the Pan-Africanist movement of Marcus Garvey, offered a return to the African continent and the construction of a Black political nation there. The Moorish Science Temple of America, founded in 1913 by Noble Drew Alai, offered a specifically Moorish identity and the claim that Black Americans were actually Asiatics. The Nation of Islam offered a different theological structure again. These were all attempts at the same project. We made an entire video about the Moors linked in the description. What the Hebrew Israelite claim offered that the others didn't was this: not just dignity and power, but a sacred chosenness that came with an already written story of exile, suffering, covenant, and eventual return. The Exodus narrative doesn't just say your suffering was real. It says your suffering was specifically prophesied. Your enemies will be held accountable, and the story ends with you going home. That's a structurally different offer from Garveyism's or Afrocentrism's dignity politics. It answers not just who are we, but what is our suffering for, and how does this end? Now for the uncomfortable part of this section. Who specifically benefits, and from what? For ordinary adherents, the benefit is primarily psychological and social, a community and identity narrative, a framework that makes historical pain legible rather than random. There's nothing cynical about that. Humans construct identity communities constantly, and the specific content of an identity claim doesn't have to be historically accurate to deliver real psychological function. People inside this movement often describe it as the first time their history made sense to them. For leaders in the radical One West descended street preacher ecosystem, the benefit is more material and more documented. The GW research on the Radical Camp's Facebook presence found a monetized ecosystem, merchandise, books, online courses, donation requests, all operating through platforms that allow this content to remain live for years without enforcement. The outrage and confrontation that defines the street preacher aesthetic is also a content strategy. Screaming at strangers outside Madison Square Garden generates footage. Footage generates views. Views generate income. The theology and the business model reinforce each other. For Ben Ami's Dimona community, the benefit was the most literal of all. Land, a community, a physical place to live outside America's racial structure. Whatever else can be said about the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, they did something nobody else in this movement did. They converted the theological claim into an actual address. By now, you've seen how the Limba case was tested and what a real buried African Jewish ancestry signal looks like when it exists. You've seen the Igbo case tested and what the result looks like when it doesn't. That context matters for this section because we're now applying the same methodology to African Americans specifically, and the question is simply whether the signal is there. Large-scale genome-wide studies of African Americans, run by researchers at Penn, Cornell, 23andMe, and other institutions, using tens of thousands of samples across multiple independent projects, consistently show the same picture. Average African American ancestry breaks down to roughly 77% West African, with most of the remaining fraction, typically 15 to 20%, tracing to Europe. That European component is the documented legacy of rape and coercive unions during slavery, not voluntary migration or pre-slavery contact. The West African signal is also geographically specific. It doesn't point uniformly at all of West Africa. Why DNA studies focused on specific American regions show strong ties to the Bight of Biafra and populations concentrated along the South Carolina and Georgia coast. Studies of Gullah communities show particularly clear signal from that region, consistent with the historical records of the transatlantic trade, which were detailed enough to track which ships came from which ports. The slave trade had paperwork. The DNA matches it. Mitochondrial DNA, passed along the maternal line separately from all the Y chromosome data, tells the same story from a completely independent angle. A study comparing over 1,000 African American mitochondrial sequences against nearly 5,000 sequences from across the African continent found that more than 55% of African American maternal lineages traced specifically to West Africa. Two different inheritance systems, tested by different research teams at different times, converge on the same map. The Cohen-Model haplotype, the specific Y chromosome marker that appeared in 52% of Limbabuba clanmen and pointed them toward Yemen, has not appeared at any unusual frequency in African American populations. The signal that vindicated the Limba's oral tradition simply isn't present in the populations that survived the transatlantic slave trade. There's no buried Levantine signal waiting to be found here, the same way there was no buried Levantine signal in the 124 Igbo men tested in 2017. When the methodology works, it finds what's there. There's also a practical way to frame this for anyone who's done consumer ancestry testing. Companies like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and others field this specific question constantly from customers who've encountered Hebrew Israelite teaching and want their results to show a Middle Eastern signal. The discovery of a hidden Israelite ancestry signal running through millions of African American customers would be the single biggest story in the history of consumer genetics. These companies have every commercial incentive to find it, if it exists. The regional breakdowns they return, customer after customer, consistently show the same West and Central African map they always have. The forensic verdict on the DNA question is as clean as these results get. The mechanism that could prove the Black Hebrew Israelite ancestry claim exists, we used it, it works, and the Limba prove it works. But it doesn't return the result the claim needs. African American genetic ancestry traces to West Africa through the transatlantic slave trade, not to the Levant. That's not a conclusion anyone had to assume going in. It's what the evidence actually shows when you run the test. Remember the third branch from Section 2. The one West descended radical sex, tracing back to a single Harlem storefront. This is where the story stops being about competing identity claims and starts being about real people getting hurt. We're spending real time here because the violence produced by this branch isn't incidental to the theology. It follows from it. The core move the radical camps make isn't the same as Crowdy's move or Matthew's move. They take the original "We Are the Israelites" claim and weld a second claim onto it that the earlier generations never emphasize with this force. The people currently calling themselves Jewish are not just different from us, frauds who appropriated an identity that never belonged to them. This second claim is what transforms an identity movement into something with a target. The vocabulary that comes out of this framework is specific and documented. Researchers tracking these groups record members calling mainstream Jews Jew-ish, using the suffix to signal inauthenticity. So-called Jews is another standard term, a phrase designed to embed doubt into every use. The theology teaches that Ashkenazi Jews specifically are descended from a Central Asian group called the Khazars, who converted to Judaism in the medieval period and have no genuine lineage to ancient Israel. This is called the Khazar theory, and it has been comprehensively rejected by genetic studies showing clear Middle Eastern ancestry in Ashkenazi populations. The Southern Poverty Law Center currently designates over 100 Black Hebrew Israelite organizations as Black separatist hate groups, specifically because of their anti-Semitic and anti-white teaching. They've created a separate term, Radical Hebrew Israelites, precisely to keep these groups distinct from the broader Hebrew Israelite faith most adherents actually practice. The most prominent radical camps: Israel United in Christ, the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, Great Millstone, and a group called the Sicarii, all trace back to that same 1960s One West lineage. Inside these specific camps, the theology goes places that need to be stated plainly. White people are taught to be descendants of the biblical Esau, recast as Edomites, a designation that doubles as a slur with a theological connection to Satan. Some preachers state outright that the white man is the devil the Bible describes. Mainstream Jews are folded in as the imposter agents of that same demonic power, the oldest anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in circulation. The claim of secret Jewish control over media, finance, and government gets absorbed wholesale into this framework and relabeled in Israelite terminology. The real-world consequences of this theology are documented and specific. In 1974, a man named Marcus Wayne Chenault, who had absorbed Black Hebrew Israelite theology under a preacher in Cincinnati, walked into Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta and shot Alberta Williams King, the mother of Martin Luther King Jr., killing her at the church organ during Sunday services. He had originally planned to kill Jesse Jackson first. He told investigators God had instructed him that black Christian ministers were enemies of the black people. In December 2019, two individuals with documented connections to the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ killed a police detective at a cemetery in Jersey City, New Jersey, then drove to the JC Kosher supermarket and opened fire, killing 3 people inside. They had chosen the store specifically because it was Jewish-owned. One of the attackers had posted anti-Semitic material drawn directly from radical Hebrew Israelite theology online in the period before the attack. Weeks later, a man who had separately expressed Hebrew Israelite beliefs entered a rabbi's home during a Hanukkah celebration in Monsey, New York, and attacked guests with a machete. Researchers at George Washington University's program on extremism spent months tracking 180 Facebook pages connected to the radical end of this movement. They found these pages survive on the platform for an average of more than 5 years before facing enforcement action, long enough to build large, loyal followings. The content included calling mainstream Jews imposters, attributing Jewish identity to Satan, and recycling blood libel, the medieval slander that Jews use the blood of children in rituals, in modern social media formats. Researchers also found that even after pages reduced the most obviously flagged content, their audience kept growing. The hatred doesn't need to look obvious to travel. In October 2022, Kyrie Irving, then playing for the Brooklyn Nets, shared a film called Hebrews to Negroes on his social media. The film argues that modern Jews descend from Khazar converts with no lineage to ancient Israel, and that black people are the true, hidden Israelites. It includes Holocaust denial and passages lifted from the protocols of the Elders of Zion, one of history's most notorious anti-Semitic forgeries. Irving initially refused to apologize, saying he wouldn't stand down, before eventually issuing a joint statement with the Anti-Defamation League after suspension. That same month, Kanye West posted that he could go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people, and that he could not be anti-Semitic because black people are actually Jewish. He was directly invoking the core radical Hebrew Israelite substitution claim, whether or not he'd spent a day inside one of these congregations. After Irving's return from suspension, hundreds of Israel United in Christ members gathered outside Barclays Center in Brooklyn, chanting, "We are the real Jews," and distributing literature built on exactly the theology just described. Here's the honest conclusion this section has to land on. The original Hebrew Israelite impulse, going back to Crowdy's 1896 vision in Kansas, was an identity claim born out of documented, real, brutal erasure. That deserves to be understood with some analytical sympathy, and we've tried to give it that in section 6 and 8. But one specific branch of this movement, traceable to one specific man, one specific address, and one specific decade, took that impulse and grafted onto it one of the oldest hatreds in human history. Both things are true. The second one doesn't erase the first, and the first one does not excuse the second. Of everyone in this story, one group did something no other branch attempted. They didn't just believe the claim. They acted on it literally. They packed up, renounced their American citizenship, left the United States, and tried to live inside the theology. That's Ben Ami's African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. And what happened to them after they arrived is a story that doesn't fit neatly into any of the categories this topic usually generates. Ben Ami led several hundred followers out of Chicago in 1967, spent a transitional period in Liberia, and arrived in Israel in 1969. They settled eventually in Dimona, a small city in the Negev desert in southern Israel, calling their settlement the Village of Peace. They expected Israel to recognize them as returning Israelites. Israel's response was more complicated than that, and understanding why requires going back to what the law of return actually says, which you now know from section 3. The African Hebrew Israelites don't describe themselves as religiously Jewish. They're Judeans by tribal descent, they say, not practitioners of Judaism as it's currently constituted. That placed them in a legal gap the law of return wasn't designed to address. The law grants automatic citizenship to people with Jewish mothers or grandparents, or to halakhically valid converts. The community fit none of these categories as Israel's religious authorities defined them. For more than 2 decades, hundreds of them lived inside Israel as stateless people, some having given up their American passports before they left. Then there's a chapter in this history that rarely gets mentioned in American coverage, and it should. In 1977, literature connected to the African Hebrew Israelite Movement's American Network was circulating anti-Semitic material that the American Jewish Committee had to actively counter. The content included the same so-called Jews and Khazar imposter framework that defines the radical camps described in Section 10. Ben Ami's own community later distanced itself from this material, and the Dimona group today does not espouse this theology. But the clean separation between the peaceful Dimona community and the radical street preacher sects wasn't always as clean as the current situation suggests. The turning point in Israel came from violence, not policy reconsideration. In 2002, a Palestinian gunman opened fire at a bat mitzvah celebration in Hadera. Among those killed was a 32-year-old Black Hebrew Israelite singer performing at the event. After that attack, the Israeli government began extending permanent residency to community members, treating their willingness to die alongside other Israeli citizens as a form of belonging, that the law hadn't managed to accommodate. It's a painful kind of recognition, but it was recognition. Today, around 3,000 African Hebrew Israelites live in southern Israel. Roughly 500 hold full Israeli citizenship. Most of the rest have permanent residency. The community runs a vegan food company called Tiva Deli that has found a genuine market. Young members serve in the Israeli military. The Village of Peace operates its own school. They celebrate a calendar built around their own theology, including an event called New World Passover that marks the anniversary of their departure from America. They built something real in the desert from a vision a Chicago steelworker had in 1966. But the legal story didn't fully close. As recently as 2023, dozens of community members without secure documentation were facing deportation proceedings. Some had lived in Israel for most of their adult lives. One man facing deportation alongside 4 of his 5 children said he would not leave voluntarily. His framing was simple. They came to serve the God of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he wanted to know why that wasn't enough. That's a question this video can describe accurately, but cannot answer for him. Here's where we separate the 2 claims this movement makes cleanly, because they are not the same claim and they deserve different answers. Mixing them up is how this conversation has stayed confused for this long. So let's finally pull them apart and look at each one directly. The first claim is historical and biological. African Americans are the literal, undiluted genetic descendants of the ancient Israelites of Judea, severed from that lineage by the transatlantic slave trade, and the people currently practicing Judaism worldwide are not the genuine heirs of that ancestry. That's a testable claim. The tools to test it exist. The same tools that confirmed the Lemba's ancestral connection to Yemen. The same tools that found no such connection in 124 Igbo men directly tested. When applied to African Americans, those tools return West African ancestry, not Levantine ancestry. The chain breaks at the African end before it even reaches the American end. The second claim is different. It says that Black Americans, stripped of their original names, languages, and genealogical records by slavery, reached for the most powerful available story of exile, chosenness, and promised return, and that this reach deserves to be understood as a human response to a real historical injury, not just dismissed as delusion. On that count, the evidence is clear in the other direction. The impulse is real. The injury is documented. And the Exodus narrative was already doing this emotional work in Black American culture long before anyone codified it into an ancestry claim. These 2 claims keep getting fused into one, and that fusion does damage in both directions. Collapse them in favor of believers, and you get the One West theology and the bodies in Jersey City. Collapse them in favor of critics, and you get the same dismissiveness that told the Bene Israel their lineage needed investigation, and told Ethiopian Israelis their recognition was conditional on institutional goodwill. Neither handling is genuine. So, here's the final position. Can Black Americans become Jewish? Yes. Trivially. The same conversion pathway that exists for anyone exists for them. and it has existed since the Book of Ruth was written. The Abba Yudaya proved this works even in an African context, even against institutional resistance. The question of whether any specific person chooses to walk through that door is between them and whatever religious community they join. No DNA required. Are Black Americans the literal ancestral Israelites of the Bible, whose historical claim supersedes or invalidates the claims of people currently practicing Judaism globally? The genetic evidence says no. The historical evidence for the ancestry chain says no. The comparative testing done on the West African populations most closely connected to African American ancestry says no. The claim doesn't survive the same methodology that vindicated the Limba. And the Limba's vindication is exactly why we can say this confidently rather than leaving it as a matter of opinion. What this movement got right is the injury. The erasure of Black identity was real. The need to reconstruct an identity from the wreckage of that erasure is real. And the impulse to reach for the most powerful available story of chosen suffering and future redemption is one of the most human things in this entire history. What they got wrong in the branches that matter most for the public conversation right now is the claim that the historical injury justifies pointing that same story's hostility outward at people who didn't cause the injury and whose own ancestral suffering is as documented as anyone's. That's the forensic verdict on this one. Same format as the others. We look at the claim, we look at the evidence, we say what the evidence actually shows. This channel isn't here to tell you what to believe. It's here to give you what the record says so you can decide what to do with it. That's the work. We'll keep doing it.